Optimism, faith, and the mud hole in between. I was born an irrepressible optimist, quick to believe the best and the sunniest in any scenario. 9 times out of 10, let's say 8 out of 9 to offset any optimistic bias, my buoyant disposition has served me well. God designed me to face trials and take risks with a certain hopeful energy. But the 10th time has often led me into a ditch. When you're regularly leaping across chasms of impossibility and finding the earth closes to catch you, you fall that much harder when it doesn't. 3 days ago, Jean had given birth to our second child, Megan. And today mother and daughter felt well enough to come home to Yirgacheffe. We'd driven the 4 hours from Shashamane to Dilla that morning without any hurdles. Although we'd originally planned to stay the night in Dilla and attempt the second leg of the trip the next day, it was still early. Spirits were high. We were eager to sleep in our own beds, and besides, spending the night here would mean we'd have to unpack and repack the Opel caravan. Only 30 miles of rough dirt road lay between us and Yirgacheffe. True, this stretch was infamous for ensnaring vehicles during the rainy season, when it could turn into a river of mud, but the skies south of Dilla were limpid blue, not a strand of cloud on the horizon. Success seemed assured. Why not finish the homeward journey? The first half of the road from Dilla to Yirgacheffe rises into the hills, while the second descends down a series of slopes. The Opel climbs steadily for the uphill portion, unhindered by its heavy freights. While we'd been in Shashamane, awaiting baby Meg's arrival, I'd had time to build desks and benches for the new Bible school at Yirgacheffe. The back of the vehicle was weighed down with pieces of wood cut to fit the trunk space. Our suitcases filled the front passenger seat, and behind me sat 2-year-old Marian, Jean with Meg, and Indalich, the young Ethiopian househelp and nanny, whom we referred to as our eldest daughter. We came over the final crest, marking the start of the downhill slope. Now we saw what the highest hills had hidden from view in Dilla, dark clouds ahead, the kind that hurled tropical rain to the earth in an instant, lashing the coffee groves and melting the soil. African rain is a meteorological category unto itself, a far cry from gentle English showers. The clouds hung there like a dare, defying some hubristic wayfarer to attempt the 50-mile shot to Yirgacheffe before they turned the world to sludge. The sky waited for me to make the first move. I should have known better. We should have turned back then. But optimism is optimism precisely because it's tenacious. When it encounters data that doesn't fit the trend, it stands obstinately by the original hypothesis that things won't go wrong. The clouds were indeed a troubling outlier, but when I considered that everything had gone so smoothly this far, and that we were so close to home, I dismissed my doubts and kept driving. Jean spoke up from the back seat, reading the weather and my inner logic all at once. "Malcolm, look at those clouds. I don't think we'll make it. We'd better turn around. We can spend the night in Dilla." Tiredness had crept into her voice. I struck a gallant tone. "Don't worry, Jeanie. We'll make it all right. It's all downhill from here anyway. Well, more or less, except for 1 or 2 spots. If it starts raining, we'll just slide our way home," I smiled at her in the rear-view mirror. She didn't smile back. We were barely a mile down the hill when the rain hit, battering the windshield, overwhelming the wipers, as forceful as a flock of birds dashing themselves against the glass. The road began to dissolve under the tires. Within minutes the rivulets became torrents. Red mud streamed down the grade around us. I was undeterred. My thinking went something like this. As long as we and the water were both moving down, we could simply flow. Where the deluge was cutting channels into the road, I could get the wheels into the ruts and use them like a railway line. The problem came when the road ceased to be downhill and levelled out. In certain patches the flowing mud and silt collected in deep drifts, creating ground with the consistency of porridge. We managed to get through a few such places, the rear wheels spinning into the slop at full throttle, the front wheels maintaining the illusion that they were still steering the car, despite the fact that we were only sliding our way forwards. The worst was still ahead, and I confess that my optimism faltered as we slid toward it. A long descent, dubbed Samonodaget, the slope of soap. A glacier of wet earth came to rest at the bottom of this notoriously slippery hill after each rain, creating an extremely soggy valley. This stretch was level, perhaps when the Italians had first built the road, but over the years a mammoth mud hole had grown, deepening and lengthening with each passing of vehicle, until it yawned some 200 feet across, 6 to 10 feet down at its deepest, like a mass grave with wheelchair access at either end. In our 2 years using this route, we'd watched uneasily as the pit claimed more and more of the road. It was a spectacular specimen, worthy of a song or legend. In the dry season, the mud hole was perfectly navigable. You simply drove down into the long trench, avoiding the deepest ruts, by balancing on the high ground between them, which was still firm at this time of year, and hoping the vehicle wouldn't high centre on the rise. When the road started to extend out of the hole, you'd gun the engine all the way out. But in the rainy season, the earth at the bottom was perpetually soft. Because trucks frequently got stuck in the hole, they tended to carry a crew of mudmen, an intrepid, usually an intoxicated team of elites, who knew how to free the vehicle by digging away enough wet soil in front of the rear wheels for the tyres to regain traction. The mudmen would first cut out a ditch on the lower side to drain the water streaming down the slopes, then crawl under the truck, furiously digging and scraping the slippery earth in front of the wheels, tossing it over the high banks of the hole, so that the truck could keep gaining ground. If it lurched forward or sideways before they could scramble out of the pit, it meant certain death. This knowledge probably accounted for the general state of inebriation. Thanks to the mudmen's efforts, the hole deepened by a few inches with every passing truck that had to be dug out. I pressed the accelerator to the floor to give us a fighting chance as we slid down the slope of soap and into the dreaded hole. For a few seconds their Opel caravan glided across the liquid earth, rear wheels revolving at full speed, goaded by a mechanical desperation. It almost seemed that we would make it. We did manage to traverse perhaps half the hole before the inevitable ground us to a halt. The wheels sank into the mud. The Opel whined and strained like a flip beetle. When it was clear that we weren't making any progress, I turned off the engine. The rain's din on metal and glass was all-pervading, and we sat for a minute without speaking or moving. Behind me, little Marion clung tightly to Dolich's arms. Jean looked paler and weaker than before. "Now we have to pray that God will work a miracle," I said. "That's the only way we're getting out of this mess." I opened my door to better assess our situation. The rain was beating down relentlessly. Water pellets rang off the hood of our captive Opel and thundered on the thick leaves of the inset, the false banana trees lining the road. A muddy river below the door still was gushing into the outflow ditch that the last mudman had added to, a long channel running along the steep earthen wall of the hole. We're about 5 feet deep in the road at this point. Prayer is a priority in such predicaments, but then you have to do what you can in faith. But what could I possibly do? I climbed out of the Opel, staggering about in the mud for a few seconds as I surveyed our options. We had no recourse. The wheels were thoroughly stuck, and there's no way I could dig them out alone. Above the noise of the rain, I heard the roar of a heavy truck coming down the hill behind us. I brightened. God was answering our prayers. In a few seconds, a large army vehicle appeared out of the deluge, bouncing and swaying down the uneven slope, stopping short at the mouth of the hole. As I stumbled towards it through the mud, many heads peered out from under the canopy at the back. There were easily enough men to push us out. I walked up to the passenger side of the cab high above me, where I assumed I'd find the commanding officer, the man who would give the order for our deliverance. I smiled broadly and turned my face up to the window, squinting against the downpour. Inflamed eyes, flushed face, a surly veneer. The man who returned my gaze had clearly been drinking. He stared down at me with an expression of utmost detachment. Something told me to proceed carefully. I selected my most polished Amharic greetings, addressing him formally, and explained our problem. I threw in a few other particularities for good measure. We had a 3-day-old baby in the car. My wife was the nurse at the Yirgacheffe clinic just down the road. Would his men please help us? His expression was equal parts contempt and annoyance. He narrowed his eyes, scowling, as he surveyed our mired car. If you're not out in 5 minutes, we're coming in over the top of you. I was too shocked to reply. What now, Lord? I slipped and splashed my way back to the car, opening the driver's door but not getting back inside, wanting to preserve the one haven of dryness in this cruel, stormy, liquid world. I told Jean the news. Her face paled by several shades. The baby wailed and Marian's eyes grew. My clothes were plastered to my skin, my pants saturated in mud up to the knees. Time was slipping away. I turned around slowly, at a total loss for a solution, but compelled to keep looking nevertheless. My eyes wandered across the whole rain-smeared panorama as if rescue might come from the trees. It did. Something moved among the close-set shrubbery and leaves by the roadside. A man appeared from the vegetation holding a large insect leaf over his head as an umbrella. He was dressed in rags so muddy that I wondered why he even bothered trying to stay out of the rain. He peered at me from under his covering. Aren't you Hunter from Yirgacheffe? Doesn't your wife run the mission clinic there? Yes, I answered, trying to stop my teeth from chattering. And my wife is sitting in the car. She had a baby only 3 days ago. I live down the hill, he said, and I heard a big truck coming just now. Came up to make some money. Well, the driver of that truck told me we have 5 minutes to get out of the mud or they're coming through on top of us. I'd said all I needed to say. He let out a whoop over his shoulder, the hallmark shout Ethiopians use to summon each other, and turned back to me. Don't worry, my men are coming. We'll get you out of our hole in no time. Your hole? We've made a good living off it in the last couple of years. Somebody always needs a hand, and we've got many. We don't mind diving into the mud, actually, he confessed, grinning. We cultivate this part of the road. Any vehicle coming through in the rainy months is bound to get stuck. Like I said, it's a good living. Cultivating a mud hole. And this man was its caretaker. I suppose the world is full of niche occupations and markets waiting to be tapped. We started to hear voices through the inset, and the mud hole gang was coming. We might be released after all. Know how I recognize you? The caretaker said as he waited for his underlings. I shook my head. My wife and I have been to the clinic a few times. I remember when you spoke at our church not too long ago. So you believe in Jesus? We only started to a few years ago when those evangelists first came to Yirgacheffe. We were amazed at the difference Jesus was making in our lives, how he changed our neighbors. This place has really changed. You can't imagine. Now we believe with all our hearts. What's the best thing the gospel has done for you? I asked. He cocked his head for a moment, thinking. It stopped us from wasting all our money on drinking and from fighting. One always led to the other, and since we're not drinking anymore, we don't fight either. Most of my men believe in Jesus too. We all work together on this hole, he grinned again. It didn't occur to me in the moment to ask what Jesus might think of catching travellers in a ditch and making them pay their way out. Relief and gratitude overwhelmed any ethical considerations as the mud squad trickled out of the rainforest, a few at a time, each man sheltering under his own insect leaf. There were 15 or 20 of them altogether, a lively ragtag team, expert hands at freeing swamp vehicles, the kind of men who merely inspire confidence, bursting with high-spirited industriousness and a gracious facility about their task. The boss explained the situation to his men, who it was he'd found stuck in their mud hole, and implicitly why I was exempt from the usual fee. They smiled and nodded. Jumping into the mud and swarming around the vehicle, I clambered back into the driving seat. "Malcolm, where did you?" Jean was mystified. Wiry, muddy bodies embraced the Opal, preparing to heave it up the solid ground. "I'll tell you in a moment," I said, and leaned out the window. "Go ahead and start the engine," shouted the boss over the crew's noisy energy. "Do you want me to put it in gear? The spinning tires would splatter anybody behind us." Yes, don't worry about us. We're used to mud. Just give the engine full power." I did as he said. The wheels turned, ground against the mud, but it was sheer muscle that moved us up the first few yards. The going was slow at the start as we forded the deep mud, but as we reached the whole steep exit slope, the mud squad gained momentum. Shouting and laughing, they propelled us up out of the hole and onto the firm road beyond. The caretaker ran beside us to see us off, splashing through the puddles. I leaned over to thank him, but he simply patted my shoulder. "Don't stop," he shouted. "Keep going till you get to Yirgachofi." We rolled down the long slope to town, dodging the remaining pits and rusts. But they were easy to get through by comparison. The rain didn't stop. Just before dark, we pulled into the covered carport I'd built beside the house. We sat in the car for a few minutes, thanking God for his strange and wonderful deliverance, listening to the rain hammer the tin roof overhead. God is full of mercy, mercy towards the foolish optimist who rushes headlong into ditches and then needs a miracle to get out. While these experiences hopefully temper our optimism, they also produce faith when we see how God rescues. But God is also just. The final evidence of the Lord's kindness in the episode appeared when I walked into town the next day. The army truck that had pulled up behind us near the hole was parked on the main road, plastered with mud, looking woefully derelict in repose. The officer was sitting in the cab exactly where he'd sat when he threatened me the day before. I couldn't resist offering the traditional morning greeting. "How do you spend the night?" He scowled. "In your mud hole. You know those people who got you out? Well, they wouldn't lift a finger to help us. Wouldn't even lend us their tools." Yes, God is merciful. God is just. May we all come through the mud wiser.